Welcome to the Atheists of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do.
If you're like me, you're concerned about what's going on, certainly in America. Even now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing a lot of stuff coming out about Putin's Christian nationalism and evangelicals in America supporting Putin. And they've been supporting him for a long time. You know, Franklin Graham, for example, has been a longtime supporter of Putin's Russia because they admire him for his sort of strong Christian nationalist stance and his anti-LGBTQ stance, his anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant stance. Recently, the other day, it was a GOP politician, I can't remember her name. She said, I identify more with Putin's values for Russia than I do with Joe Biden's America. You know, so that tells you kind of where things are headed in terms of evangelicalism and politics, certainly in the Republican Party anyway. So if you're concerned at all about that, then I think you're going to find this presentation maybe a bit disturbing. So yeah, we've seen that my brother-in-law, ex-brother-in-law now, his church is out of Seattle area where I grew up, and they are heavily involved in missions trips to Russia. And that's one of the big things, is that they've seen Russia's opened up since the fall of the Soviet Union, and they've rejoiced in that sense that, you know, we've gotten an open window for the gospel. We're going to go in there and spread the word of Christ, you know. So this is related to what I'm talking about in terms of dominion theology and missions, because in other words, basically what Christopher Hitchens said, in order for Christianity to succeed, all other religions must bow the knee, basically. So that's kind of the thrust behind what's happening. So I've got a presentation. I've got a lot of information. I'm thinking, Judy, do we want to go it's about 45 minutes-ish, and then we can open it up for questions? Yeah. So if you have a burning question, you could throw it up in the chat maybe as we go through it. But I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and then we can discuss it on the last, whatever, hour or so. How I got started looking at dominion theology. I'll just share my screen. You should be able to see. Let me know if you can you see that screen? Yeah. Okay. Oops. We'll go from the beginning. So I'll full screen it so you can see it. How I got interested in it. If anyone's seen that series called The Family on Netflix, which was from a book written by Jeff Charlotte several years ago. He's also written a book called C Street, which is kind of a companion to The Family. But I saw The Family, the series on Netflix, then I went back, I got the book, and I read C Street as well. And I'd never heard, even though I've studied theology in seminary, Bible college, and for a PhD, I'd never heard the term, dominion theology, never heard of it until I watched The Family. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend watching that on Netflix. And it's basically about this one organization, the Family, or the Fellowship Foundation, their involvement in politics, not just in America, but the world. And that kind of alarmed me. So I started researching the subject, and that was about, 5 years ago. And I've written on this. I've just gotten an article that's come out in the Political Research Associates, the Public Eye Journal. It's about Christian homeschooling in the age of COVID and sort of the backstory behind some of that, and the dominionist piece that goes into Christian homeschooling. So all that's come out of this research. I've talked to lots of people. I think you have a connection with Julie Ingersoll, don't you, down there in Florida? Maybe you do. But anyway, she wrote a book on building God's kingdom about Christian Reconstructionism. So this is kind of the interest, and I've seen this in the last 4 or 5 years. The Trump era, it's really shot up to a whole new level, with they're feeling very emboldened by having Trump in office for the last several years. So that's a real concern. So I can't approach this as a teacher. That's what I do for a living. So apologies if I'm making this too simplistic, but I approach this as if I was teaching a class. So what are the learning outcomes for this session? We want to look at the concept of dominion theology just generally, and explore its relationship to Christian nationalism. We're going to see there's a key connection between those two things. And we want to look at three streams or iterations of dominion theology and the major figures involved in their origins. So we're going to look at Abraham Vereide. You may have heard of him if you watched or read the book, The Family. He's the founder of International Christian Leadership, which is now known as the Fellowship Foundation or The Family. And then R.J. Rushdoony, he is the father of Christian Reconstructionism and really the father of dominion theology in the modern iterations of the sense of the word. And then we're going to look at the more charismatic side, which is a lot of what we saw in the Trump era, how this movement called the Seven Mountains Mandate dominion theology came about. We're going to look at Bill Bright, Loren, Cunningham, and C. Peter Wagner, as well as what are called NAR churches, the New Apostolic Reformation, which was kind of founded by C. Peter Wagner. And a lot of the Trump evangelical leaders are part of the NAR movement today. And then we want to look at the connection at the end, how dominionism underpins much of the thinking behind what we see in the Christian right, certainly in America today, but indeed around the world. So it's kind of forms the scaffolding in a lot of ways, although it's not, they're not overt about it, but it's still there. So what I hope to do by giving you this information, when you go back and start looking at people who I'm going to name in here, you're going to start seeing or hearing the language of dominionism that you may not have been familiar with before. And so you just have to know the language. For example, Ted Cruz, his father, Raphael, is a big Seven Mountains Mandate dominion theology preacher out of Texas. And you'll hear Ted Cruz throw out phrases and keywords that if you didn't know what they were, you wouldn't know his connection to this dominion theology piece. So that's an example of how you just need to know what they're talking about. You need to know their language. So some of the key concepts, I've got some quotes to share that kind of start to paint a picture of what dominion theology is, what Jeff Charlotte calls weaponized Christianity. It's not just Christianity as you might think of it, your average garden variety evangelical sitting in a pew somewhere in any town, USA. It's a very militant, weaponized Christianity. Another interesting quote here was, this is from the Lieutenant General Willard Paul. This was in 1955. This was the organization started by Vereide. He says that of the family, a partnership was formed with God to make a better world. And that was back in 1955. That shows you how far back this type of thinking goes. And he is addressing people like senators and congressmen and the president of the United States. Eisenhower was at the first prayer breakfast. They've been putting these on since the 50s, the National Prayer Breakfast. Another key quote, the book Holy Terror by Conway and Siegelman, which came out in 1982. And this quote, I think, encapsulates a lot. She said they, meaning the Christian right, people like Jerry Falwell and all those kind of people, Tim LaHaye at the time, they never actually came out and said that democracy was wrong, but they said that a pluralistic society was not acceptable to God. They said that freedom of religion was only an illusion and that democracy could only work if Christians had the leadership positions. This is a woman called Diane, who was kind of the first ex-evangelical back in the 80s. She quit believing in Christianity and got out and was kind of horrified at how the Christian right was developing. And that's the kind of, you can sort of get that idea. Christians need to be in charge of certain leadership positions. And that's the dominionist sort of thrust. And again, from Jeff Charlotte, someone said in the book, remember, it's a kingdom, not a democracy. They're not after a democracy. They want a kingdom, almost a theocracy in some ways, this idea that God is ruling over America. Another quote, if you've read that book, American Compromise, which is really interesting, it's all about the sort of whatever Putin had over Trump in terms of his, I don't know, we still don't know what Putin had on Trump or has on Trump, but there's a chapter in American Compromise about Opus Dei, which is a Catholic or dominionist organization. And Bill Barr is one of the key figures that you see associated with Opus Dei. And he calls it authoritarian theology. That's what Craig Unger speaks of in terms of organizations like Opus Dei. So it's not just confined to evangelical Christianity. We see in the Catholic Church, the Opus Dei movement is a very theocratic sort of Catholic movement. And then I had Fred Clarkson, who is from the Political Research Associates. He's done a lot of writing on dominion theology for probably the last 20 years. And he said on an episode of my show, without dominionism, there is no Christian nationalism. And we'll see in a minute the connection between the two, but there's a definite connection between Christian nationalism and dominion theology. And then the last quote in an article in Harper's, Jeff Charlotte said, this is what the family is all about, is introducing powerful men to Jesus. And you see that with the National Prayer Breakfast. And this is the agenda of the family. They're very much about going after the top levels of society, political, business, military leaders, that kind of thing. And they are trying to get them saved with a view to influencing society. And that's, again, this dominionist kind of thrust. So looking at a definition of dominion theology, where does it come from? Where does the term originate? Well, we see here in the old King James Bible, Genesis 1:26, the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And I'm just reading it in the context of the Bible. If you know the text at all, this is the creation story. God has created the heavens and the earth. And of course, it was 10,000 years ago, wasn't it? 6 to 10,000 years ago. But he's talking to Adam and Eve in the garden, and God is speaking to them in the text, and he says, he blessed them, and God said to them, now quoting God, to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. And this is the key phrase, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. That is where they get the phrase taking dominion. Where does it come from? Genesis 1:26. Now, originally, that's historically, it's always been read as an environmental sort of stewardship mandate for Christians. But as we see in the late 70s, early 1980s, certain American Christian theologians and political activists began pushing an interpretation of that same verse that read, Christians were mandated by God to occupy political power in the United States and the world, thus taking dominion. So there was a radical sort of a sea change in terms of how Genesis 1:26 has historically, for millennia, been interpreted by Christian Bible scholars and theologians. Suddenly, this became this idea of Christians taking leadership positions, thereby taking dominion. And that was a mandate from God right out of Genesis 1:26. And here's an interesting quote from Chip Berlitz. And he says, Dominionism is a tendency among Protestant Christian evangelicals and fundamentalists that encourages them to not only be active political participants in a civic society, but also seek to dominate the political process as part of a mandate from God. And they get that from Genesis 1:26. And he goes on, he says, the vast majority of Christians read this text, Genesis 1:26, and conclude that God has appointed them stewards and caretakers of earth. And that's the historic interpretation. But as Sarah Diamond explains, however, she wrote a book called Roads to Dominion. She says, however, some Christians read the text and believe that Christians alone are biblically mandated to occupy all secular institutions until Christ returns. That, in a nutshell, is the idea of dominionism. So hopefully you're kind of getting an idea of where it comes from. And this change in about late 70s, 1980s, we saw the rise of the Christian right with organizations like the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell Sr., Council for National Policy, so many organizations that came about during that sort of 7-8 year time period. So as I was saying before, this idea of dominion, taking dominion, is closely allied with Christian nationalism. And we see this all over the place right now in America, the idea that not only was America founded as a Christian nation expressly by the founding fathers, it has strayed from the path of righteousness and should be a Christian nation again. So now you start to see the dilemma that Christians are in. If you believe the idea of Christian nationalism, that America was founded to be a Christian nation, we've lost that sort of, we're off that path. So by allowing things like abortion, Roe versus Wade, by allowing same-sex marriage, those are like corporate sins. and God is angry with America. And you heard it, for example, if anyone remembers after 9/11, a couple days after 9/11, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were on the 700 Club. And the host of the show asked them, why did this happen? Why did the Twin Towers fall? And Jerry Falwell Sr. gave a classic response. He said, it's because of the gays and the liberals and the abortionists. And I point the finger in their face and I say, you made this happen. God is angry with America when you kill 40 million little babies and blah, 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 blah. That's where he's thinking. It's the fault of the gays and the liberals and the abortionists and the lesbians, people for the American way. And God is judging America. Therefore, the solution is to return America to being a Christian nation again. And we're seeing that, for example, with these draconian anti-abortion bills that are coming up right now in Texas and Missouri. And the thrust behind them is they want to overturn Roe versus Wade so that America can become a Christian nation again. That's really what's the agenda behind these kinds of bills. So and you can see that dominionism then would give them the sort of strategy or the scaffolding to get that done, how to become politically active and why you should be, because you're mandated by God to do so. So let's look at this idea of Christian nationalism. So in an article by on Politico, Frederick Clarkson of the Political Research Associates, he said, quote, once one has arrived at the notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and that this means based on Christian or biblical principles, which are used interchangeably, one holds a self-issued license to serve as a spokesperson for God and the founding fathers. Political opinions take the character of revealed truths. And that's what we see with Christian nationalists. It's almost like I think they view the founding fathers like the way they read the Bible, in that, the Bible's an ancient book, but it's still binding for today. And they'll argue that because the founding fathers were Christians themselves and they intended America to be a Christian nation, we must always stay on that sort of path, that it's still binding several hundred years later. We can't seem to get out of that, idea that America was a Christian nation. And we see, if you've heard of this guy, David Barton, or his son, Tim Barton, who's now sort of taking over as David's getting, I think he's had health problems and he's kind of retiring. His son's taken up the mantle now. They have an organization called Wall Builders out of Aledo, Texas. And what he does, he's probably the most prominent Christian nationalist. He speaks all over the country. He speaks in churches. He gives tours of the Capitol. He talks to congressmen, congresswomen, senators about America's founding a Christian nation. And he creates what Frank Labert calls as a usable past. It's nothing more than historical revisionism or a convenient myth. And in fact, someone mentioned Andrew Seidel from the FFRF. He wrote a book on how the Ten Commandments is un-American, and it goes against every law that really America has had really since the beginning. And he has a whole chapter on the myth of Christian nationalism. And so he says they weren't Christians. A lot of them were deists. He goes into the whole thing. America was not a Christian nation. And what would that even look like if it was true? So you could do a lot more research on that. But here's an interesting quote from David Barton of Wall Builders. He's talking about the wall of separation of church and state. And Barton says that wall is a one-directional wall. It keeps the government from running the church, but it makes sure that Christian principles will always stay in government. So that's David Barton of Wall Builders, and he's famous for quotes like that they believe that it should be like a semi-permeable wall, that the church or the government shouldn't be allowed to interfere in the church, but absolutely it should go the other way, where Christians can and should be involved in running the government. And that's how it seems to work, according to him anyway. So going back to that Politico article, Fred Clarkson goes on to say, the idea behind this Christian nationalism is that Christian citizens, in air quotes, must elect Christian candidates of the right sort, of course, who are then able to craft policies based on Christian principles, because that is what God requires of his Christian nation. So hopefully you're starting to get that idea of where they're coming from. And it's so closely tied with Christian nationalism, this dominionist mandate, why shouldn't Christians be in charge? In fact, they need to be in charge so that we can craft policies, craft bills and legislation that are Christian in terms of their principles or a biblical worldview, and we will shape and move America back into becoming a quote Christian nation again. And that's what we're all about. And it's only true if you believe in this myth of Christian nationalism, and it needs, America needs to become a Christian nation again. How do we do it? We elect Christians into positions of leadership in certainly the political sector. And here's an interesting quote. Christians have an obligation, a mandate, a commission, a holy responsibility to reclaim the land for Jesus Christ, to have dominion in institutions, bureaucracies, courts, and governments for the kingdom of Christ. And look at when this book was written. George Grant, 1987, The Changing of the Guard, Biblical Principles for Political Action. And it's this idea of they take their sort of model from the Old Testament, where the nation of Israel comes out of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, if you know the story with Moses, and when they take over the quote promised land, the land of Israel, that model is kind of what they follow. We're supposed to, Christians are supposed to reclaim the land, and that's where they get that language from, is from the sort of the story of Joshua in the Old Testament. And if you have to kill a few people, along the way, and that kind of speaks to why some evangelicals, or even now, are supporting Putin's war in Ukraine. If it's about reclaiming Ukraine for a Russian Christian nationalist worldview, well, that's a holy war then, isn't it? That's what you have to do. So they don't have a problem with it. So looking at these three sort of major figures in dominion theology, here we have Abraham Vereide. Now, like I say, if you've seen the Netflix series, The Family, you'll be familiar with Abraham Vereide. So where does he come from? Well, he was from Norway. He was an immigrant in 1935. He claims in his book to have a vision from God that the church had been getting it wrong for 2,000 years. I mean, every time you hear someone say that, you should start getting real nervous, because I think Joseph Smith said the same thing, didn't he, in the 19th century, that Jesus and God appeared to him in the woods in upstate New York, and the church has been getting it wrong for thousands of years. You are the one who's going to get the whole thing right from now on. So this is his thinking. And we see one of the early iterations of dominionism, although he didn't call it that. This is the idea that we see now even still. So what he says God told him, he says, don't focus on the down and outs. Don't worry about the downtrodden. Don't worry about the poor. What you should aim at instead was the up and outs, right? The key men who would be in a position to influence society for God. And that's a completely different model. If you're familiar with Christian sort of proselytizing, like I was a missionary and an evangelist. We were told, you preach the gospel to everyone, man, woman, child, doesn't matter if they're rich, poor, whatever. No, Vereide's saying we have to target key men, key leaders who then, once they get saved, they can then in turn influence society. And this is kind of this trickle down. This is before Reaganomics, Sorry, I'm just going to drink. It's sort of the argument that a rising tide lifts all boats. If in this kind of a system, when the top people running the show are following God, the blessings just trickle down. And ultimately, yes, the needy and the poor, they will get helped, but in a trickle down sort of way, not by saving them. We need to save the top key men, key leaders of society. So in my hometown, Seattle, Washington, 1935, this is how far back it goes. What Vereide does, he forms a prayer group of wealthy businessmen, and the idea is we're going to clean up the city. We're going to focus on just prayer and political action. And what happened was, he said, look, it's a success. A few years later, one of the members of this group became the mayor of Seattle, later the governor of Washington State. And what happened is the ICL, the International Christian Leadership Foundation, or what's now called the Fellowship Foundation, or better known as the Family of the Jeff Charlotte series, they expanded nationwide in the 40s. They went to Chicago in 42. And then they have moved their headquarters in, well, just outside of Washington, D.C., and they are now involved in numerous countries worldwide. So for Vereide, I think he would say, look, it's been a success. And they're the ones who put on the National Prayer Breakfast every year. It's a family-sponsored event, even though it is under the guise of a government-run event. It actually isn't. They'll put out letterheads that say, Congress is inviting you to the National Prayer Breakfast. It's not sponsored by Congress. It's not sponsored by the Senate or the government at all. It's actually sponsored by the family. But of course, virtually every president, I don't know of one president since Eisenhower who hasn't spoken at the prayer breakfast. So it's, you come to hear the president speak, and it's all about networking and meeting up with key leaders from all over the world. So this is the public face of the family, but a lot of it is we don't know what they're doing. That's why the book by Jeff Charlotte was so important, to kind of shed a light on what the family is doing. And here's a quote from Vereide. And look at how this is that same prayer breakfast in 1955. And he prayed at the end, he says, "Hear, O God, we dedicate ourselves to Christ." Speaking of all these political leaders, President Eisenhower sitting there, we want as a nation and as representatives from many nations to become one great team, working in the rhythm of defined purpose and in the warmth of God's love, and with the firmness and the fitness of disciplined minds. To this end, O God, take us now as leaders in the various fields of endeavor. And this is Vereide himself giving the closing prayer at the National Prayer Breakfast in 1955. This is how far back this thinking goes. And you can see his thinking, we come together as a nation and from many nations. It's all about working together, whatever this purpose of God has us to do in terms of key leaders. It's all about key leaders from whatever field that you come from, whether it's business or politics or the military or whatever. Vereide was interested in the top, people at the top, rather than the down and outs. All right, so let's look at the second figure. This is R.J. Rushdoony, and here he is. He's another guy. We have beard envy maybe going on there. I don't know. But here's Rushdoony. He was actually he was an Armenian, not Arminian like Calvin versus Arminian, but he was from Armenia. He was born in 1916, died in 2001. He was the first to articulate the notion of dominion theology. And he was the father of Christian Reconstructionism, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I could say a lot about Rushdoony, but we'll move on. There's a lot to say here. Now, if you know your theology at all, I'm not going to assume anyone, but Rushdoony held to a system called post-millennialism. And basically that view of end times biblical prophecy says that you have to establish the kingdom of God on earth before Christ can return. And once that kingdom is established, then and only then will Jesus return to earth. So he's operating from within that sort of theological frame and thinking to himself, okay, that's what the Bible says. We Christians have to establish the kingdom of God here on earth. That's the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign. Once we do that, then Christ will return. How do we do that? We've got to come up with a strategy or a system by which we can, establish God's kingdom. So he says, wait a minute, he's a Christian nationalist as well. He believed that America was a Christian nation. He's trying to answer this question: what would a godly society look like if we were to establish the kingdom of God on earth? And his answer was, we should govern the civil society by Old Testament law, which what he called a theonomy, not a theocracy, but a theonomy. In other words, what Rushdoony did, he developed a system in his book, Institute of Biblical Law, which came out, I think, in 72 or 74. And he argued that the 10 commandments, and this is the whole purpose of the book, each of the 10 commandments should be the laws of the land, basically. And he called for things like the death penalty of gays or incorrigible teens, or things like that. That they were to be taken out and stoned. And that's what the Bible commands. And that's what we need to do in America. We need to institute the Old Testament, and that's the law of the land. That's a pretty hard kind of view there. But how would he get it done? he had a long-term vision. It's going to take generations and generation of what he called reconstructed men. And it was a very biblical patriarchal system. And that's why he calls it Reconstructionism. You reconstruct people one person at a time. And in this context of the family, a godly family, the ideal for Rushdoony was for them to be homeschooled. Now he was kind of the father of Christian homeschooling. A lot of people don't know that, but back in the early and mid 80s, he was an educator himself, and he wrote a lot of books on this idea of we need, the messianic character of American education. And the idea was he went all over the country, and he was like an expert court witness in many, many court cases where people were suing the state to get rights to homeschool their children. And if it wasn't for his sort of advocacy work, we wouldn't have the Christian homeschooling movement like we have today, as well as the Christian day school movement. But in his view, the best context to raise godly children would be a homeschool environment. So you see things like the massive homeschooling movement in America, Christian homeschooling movement, and you see colleges like Patrick Henry College, and that basically is a pipeline which was founded by Michael Ferris of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in 2004 as a pipeline for homeschool graduates to then enter the world of the law and politics. So the most classic example right now is Madison Cawthorn. I think he's from North Carolina. He himself is a homeschool graduate who attended Patrick Henry College. Now, he was kicked out for sexual harassment, which was nothing ever came of that, but he's now a politician. And so he's Rushdoony would point to Madison Cawthorn and say that's the system, that's the pipeline, that's how you need to get this done. A guy like Madison Cawthorn goes through the system and becomes a politician, and he's now in a position to influence legislation to turn America back to a Christian nation. So he had a massive influence on Christian education and homeschooling. And I think really, from what I've researched, he provides the architecture. He becomes the scaffolding for what becomes the Christian right. And we'll see how this came about a little bit later on as we look at the Christian right. So that's Rushdoony. Here's a couple of quotes from Rushdoony. It kind of gives you a flavor for where he was coming from. The last recorded message before his death, he said, "If you believe in biblical law and are a Christian, then Christ is your king. You're going to be ruled by a body of laws very different from that governs the state, and more thorough because it will govern you from within rather than from without. And with this kind of government, you can truly create a different society." So that's that reconstructed idea. You're reconstructed from within rather than from, it's not external forces. And eventually generations and generations of these, godly families will raise godly children. You're going to have a different society. And then he said in his book, God's Plan for Victory, Christian political action is necessary towards making the state again a Christian state, and its action conform with the law of God. And that's pretty much a summary of how he was able to combine Christian nationalism with his dominionist Christian Reconstructionist sort of idea. Christians have to get involved in politics, period. That's the only way to make America a Christian nation again, and it should conform with God's law. So that was where Rushdoony was coming from. And then the last sort of iteration, this is the more sort of charismatic side, looking at Bill Bright, Loren Cunningham, and C. Peter Wagner. If you know anything about these three, anyone know who Bill Bright was? He was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now called CRU, C-R-U. Loren Cunningham founded YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. I mean, both of those organizations are still huge organizations. They're going today. C. Peter Wagner was a professor at Fuller Seminary in California, and he taught on church growth and things like that. Then he ran into John Wimber, who went on to found the Vineyard Church movement. And through Wimber's influence on him, because Wimber was very much into sort of charismatic teaching, the two guys became close friends, and that sort of opened Wagner up to this whole, spiritual warfare and charismatic side of things, as well as the dominionist piece. So he wrote a lot of books on the Seven Mountains and dominion theology. But how the story goes, if you hear about the way this Seven Mountains mandate came out, they'll both claim that each man independently received a revelation from God in 1975, laying out the seven mountains mandate dominion theology. So the story goes that each person got this revelation. They then came together and said, "You're not going to believe what God's told me." And the other guy's like, "Well, you're not going to believe what God's told me." And they both had the exact same revelation. It's a miracle. And the sort of basis is they say, well, Isaiah 2:2 is the proof. And Isaiah 2:2 reads, God is speaking in this text, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. So you have to be on top, and it's a mountain. And when that all happens, the whole world will be saved. That's kind of the idea. And they take Isaiah 2:2, even though it's completely out of context, they take it as this idea of seven mountains mandate. Now there's this website called the Generals International. This is a woman called Cindy Jacobs, and she's a big player in the Seven Mountains Dominion theology stuff now. And she's talking about how the history of this came about. And she says their mandate, meaning Bright and Cunningham, was to bring godly change to a nation by reaching its seven spheres or mountains of societal influence. They, that's Bright and Cunningham, concluded that in order to truly transform any nation with the gospel of Jesus Christ, these seven facets of society must be reached. And the seven mountains are religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And that's straight from the General's website. So their argument was that Christians should be in charge of each of those mountains, each sphere or mountain of society. And once that is done, America will become a Christian, or any nation, really. It's not just America. Any nation can be transformed if Christians are atop every one of those seven mountains of business, society, government, arts and entertainment, whatever mountain it is. And a big piece of that is this idea of spiritual warfare. How do you transform a nation? In this seven mountains theology, this is where C. Peter Wagner comes in. He helped spread this message of the seven mountains mandate. He taught it nationwide. He wrote a lot of books on dominionism, and he was one of the key founders of this charismatic NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation Church Network. So you see churches like Bethel Redding, if you're familiar with them at all, Bill and Benny Johnson, International House of Prayer out of Kansas City, IHOP KC, lots of different big major churches are part of this NAR, the network of New Apostolic Reformation, and that's got a key to the Seven Mountains Mandate Dominion theology. And you see, just look at the names. You may have come across some of these names in the Trump era. Cindy Jacobs, who I mentioned, she's with the Generals International. Have you heard of Dr. Lance Wallnau? He came to prominence. He wrote a book about Donald Trump as God's chaos candidate. He said he claimed to have a prophecy that Trump was going to be elected the first time. And he was popular during the Trump years. He was given talks in Congress and Senate, talking about how we're going to take advantage of the Seven Mountain Mandate. We saw Paula White Cain. She was Trump's, I guess, spiritual advisor. She's out of Florida, your home state of Florida. You guys know who Paula White Cain is then. Kenneth Copeland is another major player. Believer's Voice of Victory. He's out of Texas. Dutch Sheets is another. I think he's also out of Texas. He's a quote unquote prophet. Him and Chuck Pierce, Shay On, Rock Church, Mike Bickle, IHOP Kansas City, Bill and Benny Johnson, who I mentioned, Bethel Redding out of California, Sean Foyt. You may have come across Sean Foyt. If anyone knows who Sean Foyt is, he's this white guy with these big long dreadlocks, and he came to prominence during the first COVID lockdown. He defied all the lockdown regulations, and he gave worship concerts in cities all over America. So thousands of people would come out to parks and things in defiance of these lockdown protocols. And he was also famous for giving a concert at the site of the George Floyd murder. So he's a big Christian nationalist and a dominionist. He's associated with the Bethel Redding. Rick Joyner is another one. Todd White is another one who was speaking in the Capitol building, and he was recorded doing a prayer in the Capitol Rotunda. That went viral. Guillermo Maldonado, he's another, he's from Florida. Trump had a rally at his church. That's the King Jesus Church in, I can't remember if it's Orlando or wherever, maybe in Miami. So many names that you would have seen during the Trump era. A lot of these people were on his evangelical advisory board. Certainly Paula White-Cain was, and some of these other people. And they are part of the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation and International Network of Churches, which is out of Australia, but they're worldwide as well. So these are, quote, apostles and prophets. A lot of them have egg on their face because a lot of them predicted that God told them that Trump was going to win his re-election in 2020. And of course, he didn't. And so they had to turn around and say, well, actually, now they're supporting Trump's big lie because they're saying, well, he did win. The prophecy was true, but it was stolen by Joe Biden. And, you can just see where that is going. So this is the idea of the 7 mountains: business, government, family, religion, media, education, arts, and entertainment. And this idea is spiritual warfare, because you have to transform the nations. And this is all biblical language. You don't want to be a goat nation. You want to be a sheep nation. Where does that come from? Matthew chapter 7. There's this vision that Jesus supposedly talks about where at the last judgment, he's going to separate the sheep from the goats, and the sheep get to go to heaven and all the goats have to go to hell. And so you don't want your nation to be going to hell. So they say, we got to transform the nation. We want to be a sheep nation. If you're a goat nation now, we don't want to end up all going to hell. And so the idea is that on top of each one of these 7 mountains, these cultural mountains, are demonic entities. They have to be displaced by engaging in things like spiritual mapping and spiritual warfare. And I won't go into all the detail, but this is where it gets truly crazy. If you follow these guys at all, they'll say that there's like a demon over the city of Chicago, and it's all broken down into sectors, and you've got to find that name of that demon and engage in spiritual warfare and kick those demons out. And then, and only then, can Christians, take dominion over that particular mountain, whatever mountain it might be. And it really gets crazy when you get into it. And once you displace those demons, the Christian, if you're anointed with apostolic authority, and that's why it's so important that you have the blessing of an apostle in this theology, you can then take your rightful place of dominion atop that mountain of influence and help transform the nation. So it's a different sort of system than Rushdoony's dominion theology. In other words, he's saying we've got to, institute Old Testament law, and that's a pretty tough stance. The 7 mountains are much more about spiritual warfare and taking over key positions within society, but it's still dominionism. It's just a slightly different iteration. It's a slightly different stream, but they would still take their sort of mandate from Genesis 1:26. And this is kind of a helpful way to sort of break this down in terms of the differences between some of these streams of dominionism, what we call hard and soft dominionism. So soft dominionists, according to Chip Burlett, he says they are Christian nationalists, the soft side. They believe that biblically defined immorality and sin breeds chaos and anarchy. They fear that America's greatness as God's chosen land has been undermined by secular humanists, feminists, and homosexuals. Their vision has elements of theocracy, but they stop short of calling for supplanting the Constitution and Bill of Rights. So we see the 7 mountains side are on the sort of soft dominionist. There's that Christian nationalism, though. And then the hard dominionist, this is more the Rushdoony, the Christian nationalist. They believe all that, it's true, but they want the United States to be a Christian theocracy. They claim that Christian men with specific theological beliefs are ordained by God to run society. This sector includes Christian Reconstructionists, but has a growing number of adherents in the leadership of the Christian right. And that is kind of a scary thing, I think, if you think about it, because we're seeing a blend of this. And what I've seen the last several years is that within mainstream evangelicalism, certainly in America, you're hearing the language. You'll hear things like, we need to take over the 7 mountains of society. We need to do this. We need dominion. And it's just become common parlance within evangelicalism. And it's sort of like it's just accepted that Christians need to run society. We need Christians in charge. And that's kind of how the question is, how do we get there? Well, there's different streams of this, but Some would say, well, we don't want to institute the Old Testament law. We don't want the death penalty for homosexuals and incorrigible teens. However, we still think the Christians should be running the show. And so there's elements of dominionism mixed in there. So in other words, what we're saying is not every evangelical who's involved in politics is necessarily a dominionist. However, though, my argument is they may well have been influenced by elements of it. They may not have ever heard the term dominion theology, but they've been influenced by it. Why should they get involved with politics? Because they've been told by their pastor or leader that that's what you need to do, even to the point where a simple thing like Christians, they will send out these Christian right groups, they'll send out voter guides, all over the country, and they'll say, if you're a Christian and you care about the direction of America, then you need to vote for the right candidates. And so they may not know. They're like the foot soldiers. That's what Catherine Stewart says. The church person in the average evangelical church, they're just like a foot soldier. They don't necessarily know about what the people at the top are doing, the top brass of, running the show. They're the ones who are the dominionists. They're the ones putting out the voters' guides, but they've been influenced by it, even though they may have never even heard the term dominion theology. They've been influenced by it, and so we see things like this. This picture on the left is, of course, from the Capitol riots, and just a little over a year ago now, where if you were paying attention, what you saw was a tremendous blend of Christian nationalism, as well as things like QAnon, together with things like the alt-right, militia groups, the one percenters, the Proud Boys. We're seeing those groups coming together more and more and more. And we saw it under the Trump administration. And it all came together at the Capitol riots. And then you see people like this at a Trump rally, thank you, Lord Jesus, for President Trump. And I think a lot of it comes down to the evangelicals who supported Trump. In one way or another, they saw him as their means to achieve dominion. He was going to help them, make America a Christian nation again, even though he had clear and obvious flaws and everything else. They were able to overlook all that because he was, helping them achieve their agenda. So, for example, he appoints 3 Supreme Court justices. And now we're seeing, that's why I think you see these anti-abortion bills coming out now, because they're saying we finally have the conservative majority. We're going to put all these bills out with a view to overturn Roe versus Wade. That's their end game. And they're thanking Trump for doing just that. So he's helping them achieve that dominion to turn America back into a Christian nation. So just a couple of last things before we finish up. How did this become part and parcel of the Christian right? It's a long story. We could do a whole episode on that. But what we see back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, so groups like the Moral Majority, the Council for National Policy, Religious Roundtable, things like that, they bought into Rushdoony's theology of taking dominion. Now, the problem was they didn't subscribe to all of his extreme views. However, they liked this idea of finally someone's come along and really broken the text of the scriptures down and justified the whole thing. So that's our biblical warrant. That's why we should get involved in the political sector. So that's why you saw, for example, really it was the Reagan era when they turned against Jimmy Carter, because they first had supported him because he was a true evangelical. If you remember those days, 1976 was the year of the evangelical, according to, I think it was Newsweek magazine. But then they soured on Carter. Then they began to support Ronald Reagan, because he said, well, I'll give you what you want if you give me your political support. And so they had all this stuff. They just read Rushdoony. It was all right there. He'd been writing things since the 1950s. And in her book, The Roads to Dominion, Sarah Diamond says that dominion theology is the central unifying ideology for the Christian right. And that's a pretty kind of a tough statement, isn't it? That when you break it all down, they may not use the term, but it is the central unifying ideology. That's what's behind the impetus to get involved politically in the first place, and why they're doing. And what we've seen then from Reagan to Trump, we've just seen evangelicals in America becoming increasingly involved in the political sector. So here's, for example, I guess this would have been 1980. This was a huge thing for Reagan to give his evil empire speech at the National Association of Evangelicals. And he also said at a religious roundtable event, if you remember this, if you were alive then, Reagan said, I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you and what you're doing, speaking to evangelicals, to thunderous applause. And he was the first president to really come out and say, I endorse evangelicals. And they gave him his vote and they got him elected, not just once, but twice. And then, of course, these are all these famous pictures from the Trump era. We can look at around the room and just name some of the names. I mean, in the red dress, there's Paula White Cain. Next to her is Robert Jeffress from Dallas First Baptist Church. There's Mike Pence. I don't know all the names in there, but these are all people that were involved in the so-called Evangelical Advisory Board, praying for Trump, that God would anoint him. And Pence is right there. Now, he is a fundamentalist. Donald Trump's no Christian, but Pence is definitely a fundamentalist, and he had no problem with being a part of that Evangelical Advisory Board. So just a couple of last things. How is it spreading worldwide? Well, looking at the family, this is a scary thing. This is something that Jeff Charlotte talks about in his book, C Street. You have up to 8 congressmen. They have a house in Washington, D.C. They're mentored in the leadership principles of Jesus by family members. And their key text is from the book of Acts, where God is supposedly speaking and says, this man, speaking of Paul, who was blinded on the road to Damascus, if you know the biblical story, he says, he is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. So what they take from that is, this is what Christians are supposed to be about. They're supposed to be proclaiming the gospel to the kings, to the top people at the top of society. And the mandate is the Apostle Paul. And that's exactly what he did. And so they have this national prayer breakfast, which you're probably familiar with. They bring together wealthy, powerful, worldwide leaders to form relationships with family leadership. And we see people like congressmen, congresswomen, senators, high-ranking military officers, wealthy business people. In fact, there was an interesting piece in the Young Turks the other day by Jonathan Larson, who I had on the show a while ago. He's been doing an expose on this national prayer breakfast, and he's uncovered the fact that Mike Lindell, you all know him, the My Pillow guy, who's a rabid Trumpist. He's a big-time promoter of the big lie. He was radicalized by the family, and it was them who brought him into the political scene in the first place. So that's the kind of thing, they would see him as a success. Mike Lindell is a success story from the point of view of the family. And it was all in the context of the National Prayer Breakfast. And as he talks about in The Family, the book, we see countries like Uganda, Romania, especially an anti-gay or what they call pro-family legislation. So they have a worldwide sort of footprint. And we also see, finally, there's a number of NAR, New Apostolic Reformation churches worldwide. So we see churches in, South Africa and Australia and all over the UK. They will preach this Seven Mountains dominionist mandate message. So it is spreading. It's not something that's just unique to America. It's sort of catching on. In fact, there's a thing where a lot of Canadian NAR affiliated churches are taking their cues from American dominionists, and they're saying, we need to institute that in Canada here and copy the American system in terms of getting Christians involved in politics. So, it's not certainly unique to America. So if you want any more resources, these are some books and or people you could look up. Of course, Fred Clarkson, Julie Ingersoll, Jonathan Larson's been doing a series on the family on the Young Turks Network. I have a lot of episodes on dominion theology and the Christian right. Peter Montgomery is another good friend of mine from the Right Wing Watch. Sarah Posner's book Unholy is a good book. She talks about the sort of marriage between the Christian right and the alt-right. And of course, Catherine Stewart, she's written The Good News Club and The Power Worshippers. And in fact, I'm just about to drop an episode with her in a couple of weeks if you're interested in hearing what she's working on. And of course, Jeff Charlotte, The Family, and C Street. And then finally, Sam Perry, Andrew Whitehead's book, Taking America Back for God, in which they uncovered the fact that the number one driver behind people voting for Donald Trump was Christian nationalism. That was the number one statistical category. So that was kind of a new thing that they researched off the back of Baylor's poll on religion in America. So just a few resources if you want to learn more about dominion theology and what the Christian right is up to. So I'm done. So we're going to turn it back over to Judy.
That was quite a segue.
Of course, thank you very much.
I'll stop the screen share now.
Yeah, that was quite interesting. We're very familiar with Paula White, whatever her name is now.
Paula White Kane.
Yeah, she had a big
Yes.
church here in Tampa, where I live,
Yeah.
a while back with her first husband, and they had a big split and everything.
Yep.
It was quite a scandal here.
She's now married to the keyboardist from Journey. That's the thing. Jonathan Cain. He is the any rock fans from the 80s would love Journey, and then you find out he's married to oh man.
Yeah, really. Okay, so the way we work discussion is you need to raise your electronic hand if you can. If not, put a note in the chat because I can't see everybody when if you raise your hand just like that. The first half hour or so will be with everybody, and then those people who are members of the organization or people who are in your group, we will go to a different room and continue the chat. So you'll just need to let me know who can go into your room. And yes, Rick is right. This is an excellent expose of a horror story. So we'll start with Jim.
Yeah.
Jim, you have your hand up. You're muted.
Got to unmute first.
Yes, I know. Okay, thank you very much. Much appreciated your very alarming talk. And I've been aware of much of this before.
Yeah.
What kind of assessment would you have in regard to the overall influence of this movement on internal politics, both in the world and in the United States in particular? Just how big is it in terms of people actively subscribing to these views, consciously subscribing to these views? It's hard to say, I know, but
Yeah.
could you give us an estimate?
Well, I would say what I was talking about in the presentation, for example, if you read Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers, she actually talks about, she went to it was a pastor's political action committee type event at a big church in the Midwest, I think it was. She went with a friend of hers, and it was put on by the Family Research Council. So if you know anything about who the Family Research Council, they're sort of an arm of Dr. James Dobson's Focus on the Family. They're kind of the political action committee part of Focus on the Family. And they were trying to get these pastors to get their congregations to become politically involved. And that whole thing was about this presenter from the Family Research Council basically said to these pastors, and look, you're the men and women that we're targeting. You're the leaders. You just need to take this back to your home churches. And that's what Catherine Stewart's assessment was that they're like foot soldiers. They vote for the right candidates. They just are doing what they're told to do by these people, and that's their strategy. There's some people at the top running, these organizations. Their idea is to mobilize churches all across the land, the pastors, the leaders of the churches, such that the people in the pews actually do their bidding. They don't necessarily know who or why they're supporting what they're supporting, but it is all related to this kind of dominionist agenda. They don't use that language, but that's what they're doing. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the horror part of it to me.
Yeah. Nearly half of the electorate, roughly about maybe 35 million people or so. No, I'm sorry, 75 million people or so voted for Trump. Now, of the Trump voters, what percentage would you estimate are doing so out of out of the kind of religious considerations you've elaborated?
Well, I don't know the statistics right offhand, but that's why I would say the book Taking America Back for God, Perry and Whitehead, is a good resource, because what they did is they surveyed, it was the Baylor School of Religion survey, and they found that the number one driver, like I was saying, for voting for Donald Trump was Christian nationalism. That was the number one category, like a hard Christian nationalist view. So that, to me, what it tells me is that people like David Barton and others have been successful. Robert Jefferson, if you remember another Floridian, Dr. D. James Kennedy, he was a big one at the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, massive mega church. Dr. D. James Kennedy was a big promoter of Christian nationalism, and that has trickled down and trickled down and trickled down to the garden variety evangelical. Part of that 81%, a big part of that 81%, voted for Trump purely on Christian nationalist grounds. So in their view, it's working. Their message is getting across that America was a Christian nation. It needs to become one again. The way to do that is to elect Christian candidates, period.
We in trouble.
It's working.
I say we in trouble.
Yeah. So it's working. The only thing that didn't get Trump reelected was the fact that more people voted for Joe Biden. Seemed like to me, just purely more. He won a few more votes than Trump. It was a close run thing. More evangelicals voted for Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016, which should tell you something. That's a scary thought. They had 4 years of Trump, and after that, they still voted for him in more record numbers than before.
Unjustified.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Jim, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bayless, you're next.
Hey,
Remember, we limit this to 5 minutes, so I'll start my.
she says that because she knows I like to talk.
Must be the beard.
It's like Goliath.
That's right.
I'm an historian, and I see historical trends in most of this. And of course, because so much of our history depends upon the reaction to racism, I tie a lot of that to it too. But it seems like all of this began right after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954.
Yeah.
And of course, the racist reaction to Obama basically just kind of like stirred up a whole lot of this really fast, although it did seem kind of like the timing was off. They were setting America up, to fall this way, but I think Trump came a little earlier than they planned. I think, I'm just guessing, but 96 when with Plessy versus Ferguson until 1954, segregation was the law of the land. And I can't help but think that racism is driving this whole thing, the dominionism. Have you seen anything to that effect?
Oh yeah. I don't know if it's driving all of it, but it's a big factor. I just went through recently. There's a good book by Anthea Butler called White Evangelical Racism. And she goes through, and this is, like you said, that's a long standing story. You can go back to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And as a reaction to that, a lot of like Jerry Falwell Sr. and Bob Jones, they founded segregation academies as specifically white Christian schools so they wouldn't have to admit people of color. And Bob Jones University ended up losing its tax exempt status because they would not allow Black students, they wouldn't allow interracial dating even, let alone marriage, and so they finally got it back a few years ago. But she goes back and talks about, it goes back to the slave owning days and the evangelical sort of apology for the biblical warrant for slavery. And that has still fed into the Christian right even today, as you say. So there's an absolute element of racism, because the real short version is the reason that Jerry Falwell Sr. and others got involved in the political process at all wasn't because of Roe versus Wade, even though that's what they said. It was when they said, Bob Jones University has lost its tax exempt status, and that angered them, and they wanted to get them involved in politics. So a lot of those guys come out of that segregationist movement, and they said, well, it's because we want to overturn Roe versus Wade. That's what it's really about, but it wasn't. So there's some really good books and articles on the true origins of the Christian right, and it goes back to the segregation and academy issue. So yeah, there's another whole piece to this that we didn't get into.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Did you have anything else?
Yeah.
You
In fact, Randall Ballmer. Yeah.
I I just expect that this is a huge deal. I mean, my family, I'm from the South. My mother was basically, she's been a dominionist since the 70s. And my sister is also involved in this. And I've been able, and I did family history from very early on. It seems like I have noticed all of this happening since the 70s. I could see it coming. It's like step by step. I just knew it was coming. And it's I just wonder, why the hell haven't other people noticed this? But
Well, they have. It's just, which ones. Like I said, Fred Clarkson's been writing on dominion theology, and certainly Rushdoony for probably about 20 years. But it's only in the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years that more books and things have come out on it, kind of making the connections between the Christian right and dominion, the sort of the dominionist piece. I was going to say, back on your question about the racism, Dr. Randall Ballmer, there's a good article in Politico, which is about something like the true origins of the Christian right. And he goes back to the Brown versus Board of Education. He lays it all out. And I think he's coming out with a book in the next little bit here, kind of going into more depth on that subject. But
good.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about those schools. I went to one, Fayetteville Academy. It was 1969. My father was on the board of directors. He was one of the first of the board of directors, and there was no black people in the school.
Yep.
In 69 is just a big clue, because it's after 68 Southern strategy with the Nixon Southern, and I'm like, that can't be a coincidence.
Can't be. It's got to be.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bayless. We have some other people waiting to talk.
Judy, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Jan's iPhone.
Make sure you unmute. You're muted.
Yeah.
Still muted.
There we go. How about
There you
that?
go. We can hear you now, Jan.
This was in this past month's Vanity Fair. It's about Jerry Falwell's son.
Oh,
And-
yes. I read that article.
Oh, you did? Good.
Yes,
good.
I did. That went around, a few months ago, didn't it?
Yes. And
Yep.
it's an excellent article that one of the things that he wasn't very religious. But my main point was about your education or your family raising you with Bill Gothard. Am I saying his name right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
For anybody who has read any television type magazines, anything like that, if you know the Duger family, then you know exactly what their whole philosophy is.
Yeah, 19 kids and counting. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Josh Duggar. Yep.
Yep. So I just wanted to thank you for your conversation today. You've given me a lot of good books to follow up on.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think it's a good point there, Jan, because I started out researching cults because I didn't know I'd come out of a cult myself, but that's what got me started on cult psychology. And I feel like it's bled into this dominionist thing, because certainly, I mean, if there's another book I should have listed on there, which is The Cult of Trump by Stephen Hassan. If anyone's read The Cult of Trump, and essentially what Hassan does is he goes through and he talks about how this political movement is also essentially a political cult, which is, I've been saying that for a long time myself, that I see the MAGA movement, the QAnon stuff, that's essentially a cultic movement. And so to me, there's a very clear parallel and overlap between the religious piece, the cultic piece, and the political side, so I do make a connection, I think, between my background and my cultic studies with the political stuff.
And I guess that Sarah Posner book, Worshiping at the Altar of Trump and all, that
Same
should
kind
be a
of
pretty
thing.
good one. Okay.
It's very
Thank
good.
you very
Yeah,
much.
it's very alarming, especially when she lays out how the Christian right is increasingly getting in bed with the alt-right and militia groups. We're seeing that more and more as well, which is a concern. So they didn't have any problem with engaging in violence on January the 6th. And that was a lot of Christian nationalists who were part of that insurrection, because they were doing their duty as patriots. That's what they said. We are true American patriots, standing up for what's right. We have to overturn this, rigged and stolen election and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. Did that? Okay. Next would be Courtney Claire.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Clint. Looking forward to reading your article in the Public Eye. I just downloaded it and I was scanning over it a little bit. But I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more specifically about, I'm wondering, like, I'm hoping for kind of like a Cliff Notes version of what is the end game? Because I see there's definitely this like pariah attack on parents who are exhausted after the pandemic with the public schooling crisis, and just there's this encouragement for people to pull their kids from school. And I'm wondering, like, what is the machinery that you see behind that? What is the end game? And also any like resources specifically on that topic that you could recommend?
Oh man. Let's see, can we give the Cliff Notes version? Okay. But that's basically what my argument was, in that I don't want to spoil it for you, but if you're about to read it, but basically what happened during the first lockdown, as you say, so many schools were closed. So parents had little choice but to homeschool to keep their kids on track, academically. We didn't know how long things were going to be closed, did we? So what they found was they went online and they're like, oh my God, I need some curriculum. I need to keep little Johnny and little Susie, on track, science and math and everything else. And there's all these prepackaged curriculum available. You can just buy, your year level that you want, bam, download it, pay your money. What they didn't realize was a lot of the curriculum was from Christian homeschooling organizations, which was loaded with a lot of this dominionist sort of, theology, basically, because of the influences of people like Rushdoony. He was the one who was behind so much of the Christian homeschooling initially. And so a lot of it still bears his fingerprints, even though his name isn't necessarily on it. So that's kind of the quick, dirty version of how it's such a concern, and why the Christian homeschooling movement is it's infused with this dominionist theology, and parents were unaware of that going into the lockdown. And one of the things that you find is that Rushdoony himself, his whole argument was, he called them government schools. So anytime you hear the word government school from a Christian or an evangelical, what that means is it's a state public school. And he said they were being run by the government, and they're, turning kids into these little obedient robots so they can carry out the will of their secular state. And so that's why he said, you've got to pull kids out of it. Christians should pull their kids out of public or government schools and get them into either Christian day schools or homeschool, better yet, homeschool. So that's, I think, a lot of the language that you hear now, like you say, the pressure for Christians, certainly, to pull their kids out of public schools or government schools, that's from Rushdoony, and that is still very much with us today.
Yeah, and I see it like serving on multiple fronts, because it's usually the mom that stays and does the homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
So not only are you exercising that control over the content of the educational material, but you also have, you're relegating the woman back to the home and, the domestic care. I also am wondering if there's an aspect of it that's like just purely economic, and if you could speak a little bit on that. I mean, just the sheer political force of individuals who are like, F public school, like, we're taking our kids out, we don't want our tax money going towards it anymore. And like here in Florida, it has a very everything in argue, like the whole argumentation against public schools right now has a huge religious undertone. So I'm just wondering if you see it playing out on that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, really briefly, there's basically two streams of the homeschooling movement. I don't know how much you know about the history of it, but the sort of original figure was a guy named John Holt, who started this movement called the unschooling movement back in the 70s. And he was coming at it from basically a secular point of view. He wasn't religious. And a lot of people got on board with Holt early on and said, yeah, I mean, we could do a better job as parents than the public school. So there is and even still, there's still a segment of American society that would just argue purely on secular grounds. The public schools just aren't doing a very good job. It's not a safe environment. There's school shootings and, bullying and harassment and all these peer pressure things. We as parents could do a better job, but it has nothing to do with the religious side. Then on the other side, there's the Christian piece, which is a far bigger group than the unschooling, the more liberal secular side. And that's what you see. I think you're right. There's a massive push to get our kids out of public schools and get them into Christian schools or homeschool them. And it feeds into what you mentioned, the biblical patriarchy type of model, where the mother is subservient to the father in that system. And that's where, going back to Jan's point, Bill Gothard, he has a movement called ATI, which is called the Advanced Training Institute, and they are huge proponents of homeschooling. They have a whole curriculum that they'll sell you, ATI homeschooling curriculum, and it's all pushing that biblical patriarchy model where the wife submits to the husband, and that's a godly marriage and a godly home, and you produce generations of kids who grow up in that system, and they go on to replicate that in their own families, years later, and the system just breeds generations of those kind of families.
Thanks.
But you're right.
Sorry, just any specific you would
We need to
recommend?
move on, but go ahead and say, sorry.
So any specific what were you saying?
Any specific books you would recommend on that topic?
Well, I think the book by Julie Ingersoll, she has a section in there about building God's kingdom, and it's specifically about Christian Reconstructionism, but she goes into detail on how Rushdoony was involved in becoming such a major player in the homeschooling and Christian school movement back in the 70s and 80s, and that's kind of the roots of the whole thing. So that's a good place to start. Anyway, someone else had a question, I think.
Yes,
Judy.
Bethany. Bethany.
Hey, Bethany.
I'm just going to get right to the point on my question. So, what do we do as individuals or voters in an environment that seems to be inundated by misinformation or by candidates who seem to be better political organizers to defeat Christian nationalism ultimately?
That's a hard question, isn't it? It's a good question. Well, groups like this, for one thing, isn't it? If it's a grassroots thing, I don't know how many people are on this call. What do we have? 30, 40 people, Judy? I don't know, but
27.
27. So that's a good start, isn't it? There is so much misinformation, like you said, and I think the proliferation of fake news and social media, it becomes overwhelming, doesn't it? Because you feel like you can't compete with the likes of, if you're familiar with there's this new guy on the system, on the scene, this Nicholas Fuentes. Anyone heard of Nicholas J. Fuentes, the America First Political Action Committee? Here's another one. He's got a massive following on social media, and that's how he's doing it. He's spreading misinformation, disinformation, and it's so difficult, isn't it? I don't know. What do you think, Bethany? I'll throw it back at you, because how do you battle this stuff? What do you do?
I take it back to Mr. Bayless. We should learn our history, because I'm still reading books about political books by Rick Perlstein, and you learn about the conservative movement from the time of Barry Goldwater to Nixon to Reagan to Jimmy Carter. The average voter doesn't have a clue or know anything about how this all kind of started and how the threads are. There's a ton of threads, and it's incredibly nuanced. And if you don't know anything about racism, dominionism, Rushdoony, and none of that, or the dog whistles, you're just going to hear the information and go, yeah, I'm mad, but I don't know why.
I'm pissed off, but I don't know. Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It's education's probably the biggest thing, isn't it? It's one of the biggest things that we talk about coming out of cults and religious groups, isn't it? One of the best things you can do for yourself is to educate yourself on how you were controlled, how you were manipulated, how you were indoctrinated, the cult psychology of it, the whole thing. And I think there's an overlap. It's this political sector. It's like, how do you do that? You got to get educated. There's books out there, there's articles out there. You got to find them. It's a hard one. I agree.
It is. That's why we have people like you.
Yeah, I'm trying to do my part. And that's basically the push behind why I have people on the show, that I try to chase them up, because I want to talk to experts like you're talking about, Bethany, where you talk to people who are historians and experts on the Christian right, who've written books, who've written articles and researched this stuff, so they can educate people on what's actually going on out there. And it is pretty scary. Like someone said, it's a horror show, isn't it? Sometimes you kind of think, God, what are we doing?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Bethany. Did you have anything else?
Yes. And people said they loved your background, by the way.
Oh, I'm a bit of a nerd.
I love it.
Thank you.
When it was smaller, I thought it was the Van Gogh, but I see now it's better.
Van Gogh's cats.
Yes. We have Sharon Gray, who is next in line to make.
Yes, unfortunately, my camera is not working. I think I have to restart the laptop, but thank you again, Clint. And one thing, a couple people were mentioning about the board, Brown versus board, decision kind of thing, but that's the same era, 54, 55, 56, that Congress agreed to In God We Trust.
Yes.
That it all got on our money, that it got in the pledge. That all happened in that 54 to 55, 56 era. So that was a seed there. And I had heard about this Dominion Theology in '99. I lived in South Jersey, and I attended a talk at the Unitarian Church of Wilmington, the first Unitarian in Wilmington, Delaware. And I cannot remember the woman's name, and I don't think I even have any of those flyers anymore. But for years, I wondered what is happening with that. And I'm seeing this alt-right and the evangelicals sort of get more organized and stronger and making a dent in politics with the last couple of elections. So I'm seeing this, and it's such, I don't say it's a nice thing to hear you, but it's a reminder they've gotten much more in power. It's scarier. I have an evangelical daughter who wasn't in my lifetime, I didn't raise her that way. And I can, see some of the stuff there. She'll bring up Ukraine and how close it is to Israel. I'm like, well, number one, it's not, but they're talking end time.
Yeah.
And that's pretty scary when it's in your own family as well.
Yeah. Well, I was just on that point. If you notice, if anyone subscribes to the Right Wing Watch on YouTube,
yes,
they post up clips of like far right preachers and people like Nick Fuentes. There was a thing just the other week where Pat Robertson came out of retirement apparently because he'd gotten a prophecy from God about how Putin's invasion of Russia or Ukraine was all ordained by God, and like you say, he's actually going for Israel. That's where his target is, and it's all about end times prophecy, and this is all kicking off now. And there's a good point by Bethany, Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen Cobes Dumais. I've had her on the show a couple of times as well. That is basically her argument is that decades and decades of this biblical patriarchy and toxic evangelical masculinity led us to worship, or led evangelicals to worship a guy like Trump. We've been so used, or Christians have been so used to that type of model in churches and in Christianity, that when Trump came along, it was like, here's another authoritarian strongman that God put in place. So that's what we have to do, submit to his leadership. So I'd recommend Jesus and John Wayne for sure.
Okay, and yes, you mentioned Nick Fuentes, and I think the article, I can't remember whether it was in the Washington Post or the Times this past week, of him actually leading, I guess, the Latino population towards this as well.
And he came out the other day and said that he supports Putin, and that he agrees that Putin's doing the right thing. There was a thing, I don't know if you've seen this, it might be on PBS in the States, but here in this country, it was on the BBC One. Louis Theroux, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a journalist for the BBC. He's done some fascinating exposés. He did one on the Westboro Baptist Church years ago, and then he went back 5 years later. If you haven't seen that, that's well worth looking that up. But he did a thing, and he had Nick Fuentes on there, and he was doing a conference. I think it was in Florida, actually. Again, it all comes back to Florida somehow. But the America First Political Action Committee, and he was saying in this conference, he said, America is a Christian nation. and everyone starts cheering, Christ is king, Christ is king, you know. So Fuentes is a Christian nationalist, he's a racist, he's a, you know, white supremacist and all the rest of it. And he's garnering massive support right now on social media among sort of like this white gaming community of disaffected young men, you know.
Yes. Now, I have to ask Judy, is this presentation available later, and how do you get to it?
Yes, it's going to be on our YouTube channel as long as Dr. Heacock agrees.
Mm-hmm.
That's
true, because I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, Bethany is saying, she spoke at that America First PAC rally, along with a couple other evangelicals. So yeah, of course she did. But you know, people like her, Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, these are like the face of the new Republican Party. Madison Cawthorn. That's what we're seeing. It's becoming a cult of Trump, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Mr. Reinhardt?
Yes, I just have a couple of very quick tidbits. One, you mentioned Boundary Board of Education as a catalyst to the white supremacist movement. I wanted to add that the Madeline Murray O'Hare prayer in school case resulted in an exponential increase in private Christian schools, of which they've been trying to get us to pay for ever since. Mm-hmm. Bob Jones University is being white and racist. If you walk out in front of Bob Jones University, you'll be standing on Wade Hampton Boulevard. Wade Hampton was the greatest, had more slaves at the beginning of the Civil War than any other Confederate. And lastly, Pat Robertson predicting the end of the world by way of Israel. This is his fourth or fifth shot at that.
At least, if not more.
Like everything else, sooner or later, I guess you might be right.
Yeah, law of probabilities. You're going to get it right eventually.
But not because of Israel.
Yeah.
I just had a few comments.
Well, it's a good point to jump on that, because the nation of Israel is a huge factor in so many evangelicals. And one of the reasons why they were so ecstatic, for example, when Trump opened up the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, if you remember that.
Yes.
Because there are it's kind of this Christian Zionism. It's a huge movement in America. You've got so many evangelicals that support the idea that all the end time prophecies point to the nation of Israel. It's all going to end there. And so let's see, who was it? John Hagee, who's out of Dallas. He's a big Christian nationalist, a big pro-Israel guy. He gave some sort of a prayer. Yeah, he gave a prayer at the opening of the embassy, and he basically said, you know, we're thankful that you recognize Jerusalem as the rightful capital of the Jews, you know, and it just angered all the Arabs and everybody else in that area, you know, that all the prophecies are going to culminate right here. This is why this is so important.
It was interesting how the prophecy shifted from the bear and the Russians being the reason for the end of the world to the Arabs in the Middle East after 9/11. How the Bible changed.
But I can remember when I was during the first Gulf War, if you remember that, when you know, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the evangelicals, I was an evangelical at the time, I was freaking out because I thought it was going to be the end of the world. I knew it was all about Armageddon, and you know, there were books being written and all that kind of stuff about, is this the end of the world? Is this the beginning of Armageddon? Oh my God, you know, and I was freaking out at the time too. Because I was big into Bible prophecy, you know.
Thank you.
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.